I noticed the moment he said waterfront property for the third time in one evening. Not the view, not the sunsets, the property. That should have been enough. But I smiled and passed him the salad bowl, because my son was looking at me with that hopeful, please be nice expression he'd been wearing since he was 7 years old and brought home a stray cat. Some things don't change. My name is Elspeth. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a family physician in Nanaimo, British Columbia, and I retired 2 years ago to a house I bought with my own money on a half-acre lot that backs onto Departure Bay. The house isn't grand. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, cedar siding that needs painting every few years. But the water is there every morning when I open the kitchen blinds, and after everything I've been through, that view is the only luxury I ever really wanted. My husband passed away 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had 30 years together, and I won't spend time describing what that loss was like, because if you've lost someone that way, you already know, and if you haven't, I hope you never find out. What I will say is that I rebuilt slowly. I went back to work full-time. I paid off the mortgage. I maxed out my RRSP every single year. I built a portfolio that my financial advisor, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who wore sensible shoes and didn't believe in small talk, described as quietly impressive. I never told anyone the exact numbers, not my sisters, not my son, nobody. My son, Alec, is 34. He teaches high school history in Victoria, takes the ferry over on long weekends, and has his father's way of laughing at his own jokes before he gets to the punchline. He is genuinely one of the kindest people I know, which is both his greatest quality and the reason I worried about him the moment he called me last November and said, "Mum, I've met someone. I think she might be it." Her name was Sable. That's not a name I'd heard before. He said she was from Calgary originally, working in Victoria as a real estate agent, early 30s. Divorced once, no children. He sounded so certain, the way people sound when they've decided and are just waiting for the world to catch up. I met her 6 weeks later, at my kitchen table, over a dinner I'd cooked myself. She was striking. Dark hair, very put together, the kind of person who seems like they're always slightly more prepared than everyone else in the room. She brought wine and complimented the house within the first 2 minutes of walking in. "The view must be incredible in summer," she said, standing at my kitchen window. "It's nice year-round," I said. "I imagine property value has just gone through the roof since the pandemic. Waterfront in Nanaimo is practically impossible to find now." I told her I wasn't thinking of selling. She laughed and said of course not, she was just thinking out loud. It was the occupational hazard of working in real estate. I believed her. I let it go. The second time she mentioned property value, we were sitting on the porch in January, and Alec had gone inside to make tea. She asked me, casually, whether I'd ever considered a secondary suite. Apparently there were good grants available. She could connect me with a contractor she trusted. I said I liked my house the way it was. She nodded, changed the subject, very smooth. The third time, it was March. They'd been together 5 months. We were having dinner at a restaurant in Victoria to celebrate Alec's birthday, and somehow the conversation turned to estate planning. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, that a close friend of hers had died without an updated will, and it had been such a mess for the family. She looked at me. "I imagine you've got everything sorted, though, with your background." "I do," I said, and I looked right back at her. Alec was looking at the menu. He didn't notice. He never noticed. I drove home on the ferry that night and I sat with my coffee in the car deck the way I sometimes do, watching the lights of Victoria get smaller, and I thought about the way she'd looked at me. Assessing. That's the word. Sade. The way you look at something you're trying to figure out how to acquire. I didn't say anything to Alec. Not yet. I'm a physician. I don't diagnose without evidence. But I started paying attention differently. She worked in real estate, so it was natural she'd know people. She knew mortgage brokers, notaries, estate lawyers. She mentioned them often, always helpfully, always in the context of being useful. She offered to connect me with a notary she trusted after I mentioned offhandedly that I needed to update a beneficiary designation on an old policy. I declined. I called my own notary, a man I'd worked with for 15 years. In April, Alec told me they were engaged. I hugged him. I told him I was happy for him. I asked to see the ring and I said it was beautiful because it was. He was glowing in that way people glow when they're certain they've made the right decision, and I couldn't take that from him on a feeling. I needed facts. Here is what I did. I called my financial advisor first. I told her I wanted to do a full review, update everything, make sure the titling on every account was exactly right, that my will was current. She came to the house with her laptop, and we spent 3 hours going through everything. When she left, every document was in order and nothing had changed, except I now had a much clearer picture of what I had and how it was held. Then I called my oldest friend, a woman I've known since nursing school, who moved to Calgary 20 years ago and knows everyone in that city. I asked her, quietly, whether she'd ever come across a real estate agent by Sable's name. She said she'd ask around. She called me back in 4 days. What she found wasn't criminal, I want to be clear about that. But it was a pattern. Sable had been married once before to a man in his late 50s, a widower with a paid-off house in Mount Royal and a decent investment portfolio. They were married for 18 months. They divorced. He kept the house, but not, apparently, much else. My friend's contact, a woman who'd worked in Calgary real estate for 20 years, described Sable as very strategic about who she attached herself to. That was the phrase she used. Strategic. I sat with that word for a week. I didn't confront Alec. I want to explain why, because I know how it sounds. He was happy, genuinely, visibly happy in a way he hadn't been since before his father died. And everything I had was still circumstantial. A woman who asked too many questions about property values. A first marriage that ended badly. A source who used the word strategic. None of that is proof. None of that is something a mother can bring to her son without looking like she's the problem. So I waited, and I watched, and I quietly did what I had always done when I suspected something was wrong. I gathered information. In June, I had lunch with Alec alone. I'd made that a habit, lunch or coffee, just the two of us, once a month. I asked him how things were going with wedding planning. He said great. I asked if they'd talked about finances. Not prying, I said, just asking, because it was something his father and I had done early on, and it had saved us a lot of grief. He shifted slightly. Said they'd talked about it a little. Sable thought it would make sense once they were married to consolidate some things. Simplify. Consolidate what exactly? I asked. He got a little vague. Said she'd mentioned that having one primary account made things easier for couples, made bill paying simpler. He said she'd suggested he look into whether there were benefits to being listed on certain assets. He said it in the tone people use when they first heard it. Something that sounded reasonable when they first heard it. I kept my face to my assets at all. I asked. Has she mentioned my since assets at all? I asked. He looked uncomfortable. She might have said something about whether it would make sense for the three of us to do a family financial plan together. As a unit. As a unit, I repeated. I called my lawyer the next morning. A real estate and estate planning lawyer I'd used for 20 years. Not a friend, just someone good. I explained the situation, what I'd observed, what Alec had told me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do not add anyone to any title. Do not sign anything. Do not discuss your finances with her or in front of her, and keep records of any financial conversations she initiates." I started keeping notes. Dates, times, what was said. I kept them in a plain notebook in my desk drawer. The wedding was set for the second weekend of September. Small ceremony on Salt Spring Island, a place Sable had chosen, a venue that cost more than I would have spent, but that Alex said she'd been dreaming of for years. I offered to contribute to the cost and was told, graciously, that it was handled. That made me more uneasy, not less, because I knew what Alec made as a teacher, and I couldn't imagine how it was handled unless someone had done some very creative accounting. In August, something shifted. Alec called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He usually texted. He sounded strange, not upset exactly, more like someone trying to sound normal when they're not. He said Sable had suggested that, as a wedding gift, I might want to add him as a joint owner on the house. "Just so the family has stability," he said, quoting her. "She said it would simplify things if something happened to you." I was quiet for a moment. "Alec," I said, "has she told you what joint ownership would actually mean?" Legally? He didn't know. Of course he didn't. He teaches history, not property law. I explained it to him plainly, the way I'd explain a diagnosis to a patient. Joint ownership means he could sell the property without my consent in certain circumstances. It would affect my estate plan. It would expose the asset to any claims against him. It was not a gift. It was a transfer. He was quiet. "She said it was a normal thing families do," he said. "It's not," I said. There was a long pause. Then he said he'd think about it. I could hear in his voice that he wasn't sure who to believe, and that broke my heart in a quiet, patient way. 2 weeks before the wedding, my friend in Calgary called me again. She'd heard something else. Sable had been in touch with a mortgage broker she knew there, asking questions about what a spouse's entitlement would be to assets held before a marriage. Under British Columbia's Family Law Act, asking what the threshold was, asking how long a marriage needed to be for certain claims to vest. I wrote the date in my notebook. I called my lawyer. She said, "Now we have something." She also said I needed to think very carefully about how and when I told Alec, not because he wouldn't believe me, but because of how he would feel. Because finding out that someone you love has been mapping the legal architecture of your family's wealth before the wedding cake is even ordered is a particular kind of devastation, and he would need to be ready to 2 weeks. I thought about that for 2 weeks. I thought about it on the ferry. I thought about it walking along the waterfront in the early mornings. I thought about what his father would have done. I decided I would tell him before the wedding. Not at the wedding, not in public, not in a moment of drama. That wasn't what this was about. This was about my son. I drove to Victoria on the Thursday before the wedding. I called Alec and asked him to meet me for coffee. Just the two of us. Said I had something I needed to talk through with him before the weekend. He could probably hear something in my voice because he said yes without asking questions. We sat in a small cafe near his apartment. I had brought my notebook. I had brought a brief summary my lawyer had prepared, at my request, of Sable's inquiry to the mortgage broker and what it indicated about her intentions. I had brought a copy of a provision in the BC Family Law Act that was relevant. I don't believe in emotional confrontations. I believe in documentation. I told him everything, quietly, in order. I told him about the pattern of questions about property value. I told him about the first marriage and what my friend had found out. I told him about his own conversation, the one where he'd asked me to put him on title. I told him about the mortgage broker call. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "I've suspected since January," I said. "I've had documentation since August." He looked at the table. He was doing that thing he does when he's trying not to cry, where he presses his lips together and looks slightly to the left. He did that as a child when he was trying to be brave about something. "I loved her," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. Did she ever actually love me?" I didn't have an answer to that. I told him I didn't know. I told him that was a question only she could answer, and that he might never get an honest one. I told him that wasn't his fault, that people like this are skilled at making you feel chosen. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "What do I do now?" I said that was entirely up to him. I said I had protected my assets and would continue to do so. I said that if he wanted to go through with the wedding anyway, I would love him regardless. And I said that if he didn't, I would help him with whatever needed to happen next. He canceled the wedding on Friday morning. He called her. I don't know exactly what he said. He didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. What he told me was that she became a different person on the phone. Cold, then calculating, then very focused on what she was entitled to given the engagement. He said it was like watching a mask come off. He came and stayed with me for a week. We walked along the bay every morning. He cooked dinner 3 nights in a row, which is more than he'd done in years, and I think it was because he needed to do something with his hands. We didn't talk about her every day. Some days we just watched the water. He's back in Victoria now. He called last week to tell me he's doing all right. He said he'd started seeing a therapist, which I was relieved to hear. He said he'd also signed up to teach an evening course on Canadian constitutional history at a community college, which made me smile, because that's the most Alec thing I could imagine him doing. Before he left, we sat on the porch on his last evening, tea going cold the way it always does, and he asked me why I hadn't said something sooner. I told him what I'd told myself all those months, that I needed to be sure, that I love him, and love sometimes means waiting until you have the full picture before you speak, that I wasn't willing to risk our relationship on a feeling, even when the feeling turned out to be right. He nodded. He leaned over and squeezed my hand. "Thanks for watching out for me," he said. I told him that's what I'm here for. The bay was flat that evening, the way it gets in September before the autumn winds arrive. The light was going the way it does, slowly, generously. I'd planted a new rose bush along the porch railing in July, a deep coral variety that had bloomed 3 times already and looked like it planned to keep going well into October. I thought about property, about what it means to build something over 30 years and still have it be standing, about what we protect and why and who we're really protecting it for. The house isn't the point. It never was, but my son sat beside me on that porch and drank his cold tea, and that is what I built all of this for.